Okay, Tehani, we're ready to start.
Oh, hi, can you hear me? Okay. Hi everyone. Hi, welcome to FemCon's event on memorializing and remembering and celebrating feminist work in Sri Lanka. The intention of this event is to celebrate feminists and their work, both those who have passed. Sorry, can everybody mute their mics? Can you mute everyone?
Email. The network is unstable.
Okay, somebody is still unmuted.
Yeah, I mean, I'll try and mute people, but I have to do it one by one because I don't want to mute you. It would be great if everyone can hear us, if everybody could just mute their mics so that we can get the best possible audio quality for everyone else.
Okay, I think we're good now, no? Okay, so let's start again. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our event. So we're calling it Looking Back and Looking Ahead because we both want to celebrate feminists and their work, feminists we've lost in the past few years, but also going back actually, beginning in the 80s. And there are many more that we are able to celebrate in this event, but no less important. And we're also looking at feminists who are currently working and carrying on that work. We have an incredible panel here with us today, and Subha will introduce them at length. But we're looking at issues of public education, socialist feminist organizing, women's political representation, movement building between communities, and much more. So it should be an incredible panel, and thank you all for participating. Subha, over to you.
Thank you. Yes. So like Tehani said, we're very excited that these 5 speakers have taken time out of what is no doubt their extremely busy lives, especially at this particular moment when I think, as we all can acknowledge, we're all, you know, in this country, but also outside, living in extremely difficult, challenging times. And these 5 women are you know, really kind of very integrally involved in their communities, in their work. So I think it's really special, and it really says something about you all, that, you know, you took time to be here to prepare and you know, to take on this conversation. As Tehani said, you know, we just really want to kind of acknowledge that, of course, in one evening and in a couple of hours, we're not going to do justice to the incredible, you know, people who have come before us, who are no longer with us. We're only remembering 5 such women today. Of course, there's many more that, you know, should, of course, be memorialized. And perhaps we'll do, you know, another event. Perhaps we'll turn this into a series or something like that. But some of the, you know, people that we just wanted to name, I think, you know, who we didn't sort of include in today's event, but we wanted to name nonetheless. One was Agnes Mendis. The other is Mala Dasanayaka. And we also wanted to remember Kusum. Agnes, I think, was, you know, a real, really a big part of the old women's movement. I think, you know, many of us, I don't know, certainly myself, I remember her very vividly as a child, as just being, you know, absolutely active, full of life, full of energy. And I think she, you know, she passed away fairly recently. And I think leaves, you know, a very big void in the movement. But, you know, becomes someone that is just, you know, a great legend in our history, as the others are. Mala as well, I think many of you might remember from, you know, who sort of was the bedrock of Kanta Handa. And I think also her death was a big loss to many of us. And Kusum, who founded Abhimani, which is, you know, to date, Sri Lanka's only self-led sex workers' rights network. And again, I think did an incredible and kind of very extraordinary job, a piece of work that really not many other people were willing to take on, and fought many battles that a lot of people didn't want to take on and didn't want to fight. So those are just, some of the people we wanted to name. And I'll just quickly take you through the format. So we're not in particular going to be spending too much time remembering the women that we're paying tribute to. I mean, I'll try to do that, to do some of that, but really we also want the focus to be on our 5 speakers and the work and the kind of issues that they're bringing to the discussion today. So we'll let the 5 of them speak. And then we will kind of take questions from each of them to one another, if they should have any. That will be the sort of the second part of the event. And then, of course, finally, we'll end with questions from all of you for any or all of them, okay? And I hope that that's okay with everyone. So, Ambika, we would like to start with you. And, we'd like to start with remembering Shanthi Sachithanandam. Tehani, can we have the first slide, please? Tehani?
Can you make me a host, please, or enable screen share?
You should be able to share, no? It's not?
No, I can't share.
Okay, sorry, one second. Sorry, done. Great, thank you. I'd also just like to extend our thanks to Aranya and Narmada, who both were very kind to share some photos with me, because we really wanted to be sure that we shared images with you all today that, were with the knowledge and with the permission of surviving family. But also, we thought it might be nice to show you some images of some very famous women that, maybe we aren't as used to seeing as the ones that we see often on the internet or things like that. So thanks very much to Aranya for this lovely photo. So actually, I'd like to just read, Kumudini Samuel's words in remembering Shanthi. Shanthi, of course, just before we go on to Kumi's remembrance of her, many of you will know, founded Biludu, which is an organization that has for a very long time worked to advance gender justice and women's political representation in the North and the Northeast. And I think is very, very kind of greatly missed by many of us. So Kumudini Samuel remembered her in saying, in daring to be different, she was the Tamil student well into Tamil nationalist politics. She recalled being a complete misfit and being alienated at times from both groups. She was also the student who went pell-mell into speaking against ragging on campus in her very first year, earning the displeasure of senior students, while at the same time, she was also that student who called President Jayaweera to criticize the use of police force to intimidate students suspended for ragging. Coming from a socialist persuasion, she laughed once about a year-end assignment at the architecture faculty, in which she designed a kitchen for low-income households, basing her work on visits to poor households in the vicinity of the Vallavata Canal, and having to compete with the swish designs of pantry cupboard kitchens, as she called them, put up by other students. So that's just a little excerpt from a remembrance by Kumudini Samuel of Shanthi. And Ambika, over to you.
Thank you, Subha. Thank you for inviting me to be part of this conversation. So I've known Shanthi for many years because we occupied the same larger civil society community. But what stands out in my memory are the interviews that I did with her 8 years ago, actually, for my paper on gender and Tamil nationalism. There were these very too long and chatty interviews, which I was reading today in preparation for this event because I wanted to recall her thoughts on Tamil politics, Tamil nationalism, relationship the Tamil community has with violence, the LTTE, the other Tamil armed groups, role of women in all this. The reason I raise all these issues is because all of them continue to be relevant to and impact on Tamil women's political participation and representation even today. In Sri Lanka, we don't live in a post-ethnic country, and ethnicity continues to impact our life in a multitude of ways. Shanthi, for instance, was viewed by many as a strong Tamil nationalist, and she herself in this interview told me she was sometimes called a kotia. But she said at the same time, she had to also defend, or in a way try to prove her commitment to Tamilness within the community. 30 years later, many of us are still doing the same. What I remember about Shanthi are her spirit and tenacity. And you definitely need those qualities to survive in the Tamil political sphere. I am not using the word thrive, but survive consciously, because I do not know whether the conditions are conducive to thriving if you are a woman who wishes to break out of the existing power structures and the usual way of doing things. Shanthi described herself thus. She said, I was a real troublemonger. Those were her words. By that, I think she meant disruptor, and a role that she played very well, because Shanthi, by just being herself, I think, made us confront the paradoxes in the Tamil community and in Tamil politics. Because in order to engage with Shanthi and to try to understand her, you had to accept that living at the intersectionalities of these identities of Tamil, of woman, of Tamil woman, of activist, dissenter, public voice, someone caught between the state and the Tamil community, it tends to be messy, complex, and a contradictory experience at times. In the Tamil community, the nationalist struggle was instrumental in bringing women into the public sphere. It sometimes blurred the boundaries between the public and the private spheres. It sometimes politicized the private sphere and thereby mobilized women to support the nationalist struggle. While women played an active role in the nationalist struggle, they were not always successful in exercising agency and capturing power to create space for their voices to be heard. So Tamil women sometimes created alternate spaces, which, while not always established with the specific aim of challenging nationalism, sometimes unwittingly or indirectly did so. However, even within these spaces, women were not always able to challenge the nationalist discourse for the sake. Sorry? Did you say something, Subha?
No, keep going.
Okay. They were not always able to challenge the nationalist discourse for the sake of keeping the collective together and engage in civic activism on common issues. So in order to be political, they were sometimes forced to be apolitical. So Shanthi described the Tamil parties thus. There's so many great quotes in my interview, I realized today. She said, now it is all white-haired men with maybe a single woman sitting in a corner somewhere. And I think that description still holds true. She said it will never occur to Tamil MPs to call a debate in parliament on issues affecting Tamil women because they don't view women's emancipation as necessary for achievement of self-determination. They don't make the connection. But how can Tamil people determine their own destiny when women can't? She said she saw their campaigns and it was always vote for Tamil, Unarvu. Unarvu is like, the feeling of Tamilness. As she rightly pointed out, everything was and even still is to a large extent subsumed within the greater Tamil cause, which means that inequalities within Tamil society, such as class and caste, are not even acknowledged, and their intersectionality with gender is ignored. But Shanthi, in her engagements and pronouncements, was aware of both these factors. And perhaps that is one of the reasons she viewed herself as a troublemaker or a disruptor. I do believe women have to be elected to parliament, and we do need to remove barriers to their participation and representation, no doubt. But let's remember that when women are elected, what we achieve is formal equality, which is needed, well and good. But a lot of work still needs to be done to achieve substantive equality. So what do I mean by this? I urge people to not act as if the mere presence of women will bring change in the way power is distributed, or think that inequalities will be addressed. Let's not think that just because they are women, they will be supportive of issues that impact women. Because our experience in Sri Lanka has shown us that this isn't always the case. Also, when we do that, we are essentializing, because we're saying just because you're a woman, you're progressive, enlightened, feminist, etc. But the reality is that in our political ecosystem, in order to survive and particularly to thrive, many women may need to or may choose to support unequal and exploitative power structures. They can, in the process, become, what's called foot soldiers of patriarchy. Therefore, once women are in power, let's focus on what they do and hold them accountable on the basis of our values and what we expect from them in terms of support for the issues that impact women. But at the same time, women in politics also need a lot of support, as many find it difficult to survive in a sexist and patriarchal system. So it could be in relation to information, it could be in relation to strategies. So I'm not saying that men are knowledgeable or strategic, because we see every day that male parliamentarians are not. What I am saying is that if we want women in politics to support the rights of other women, we also need to support them and equip them with the needed skills, particularly when they come under attack. I think that is when we must also support them, when they are attacked due to their sex. Politics is also about community. And I think Shanthi's struggle to start a political party illustrated that. Politics is about who votes for you and what kind of person you have to appear to be. And not really actually be, but appear to be, to gain social acceptance and win votes. So Shanthi speaks of a public march she organized in Vellavatta years ago to mark 16 days of activism, with a focus on war-affected women and the difficulties she encountered in getting people to participate. She said that the lack of participation angered her, leading her to write an open letter to express her anger, but that she was unable to publish this letter in any of the Tamil newspapers, because they just declined to publish it, because she was also being very critical of the community. While some at that time questioned the purpose of a public display, why did she organize this march? Her rationale was that during a time when the issue of war-affected women wasn't being spoken publicly and wasn't garnering the required attention, she wanted to occupy public space. Beginning the march from an area that was predominantly Tamil was to show that Tamils were concerned and were showing it. So she then asks questions about why didn't they participate, and says it could have been due to fear, it could have been due to apathy, could be a feeling that, they are not the ones affected. We are in Colombo, we're secure, so why should we? But this brings us to intra-community divisions, Colombo versus Northeast, Colombo versus North, North versus East, Northern Peninsula versus Vanni, which also play a role in Tamil women's participation in the political sphere. For example, when I was invited to contest, some within the TNA who were agitating against it said that I'm from Colombo. That is, I was born and grew up in Colombo. So in that instant, the work that you have done your whole adult life on human rights, on minority rights, PTA detainees, or alleged former combatants, it all disappears. And what comes into focus is that you are not Tamil enough, merely by the place in which you were born and grew up. Of course, that was a political tactic, but the fact is it is used because it is considered legitimate and because it is thought to have traction within the community, which illustrates the deep divisions within the community that one has to overcome. In many ways, I think Shanthi felt, and I agree with her, that because she spoke her mind and couldn't be force-fit into a socially acceptable or narrow or conservative box and couldn't be controlled, that it made the Tamil political establishment wary of her. She narrates her experience of engaging with the Tamil political parties and says that she asked one of the party leaders for the constitution of the party, which she said was not given for weeks despite her asking. And she said that made her realize that the structures as they existed wouldn't work because as they had very little capacity to be drivers of change. So I would like to end where I began, to say that what is needed is disruption and disruptors in the positive sense. We do need to disrupt the entrenched conservative, patriarchal, parochial power structures that function on inequality. Because within such structures, progressives, and particularly feminists have no place. So if you want to increase, Tamil women's political participation, or frankly, any, just women's political participation, I think we do need to disrupt, these institutions, structures, and processes. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Ambika. With that, we'll be moving on to Harini. And Tehani, could you put up the next slide, please? The one after Shanthi's photo. So Harini will be speaking about sort of her experiences and what she observes about a sort of left feminist organizing in Sri Lanka at the moment. And through this, we are paying tribute to Sunila Abeysekera, who is known for many things, of course, but may not be as well known for the sort of early part of her life in activism, which was really in the Marxist socialist youth movements of the late 60s and early 70s that happened here. And she was, of course, very famously part of the Vimukti Gi, the song troupe of the early JVP, and so on. But most importantly, I think she really, worked hard to document women workers' struggles from the early 70s to the 80s. And what you see here is the cover of a sort of an early publication that was printed in the sort of late 80s, where she documented women workers' struggles from 1980 to 1986. So in Sinhala, it's called Aragalaye Strihu, which sort of translates to women in the struggle. And in this little booklet, she documented women workers' strikes, nurses' strikes, other kinds of union action where women were leading. And I think it sort of marked also a very important moment in her own political activism. And I'd just like to read with that, Dayapala Thiranagama remembering Sunila. My first meeting with Sunila was unforgettable. It was July 1976, and I was being held at Slave Island Police Station. I was waiting in my cell for yet another excruciating round of torture, which I had been subjected to since I had been abducted 2 weeks ago from my university boarding house. All of a sudden, as if from nowhere, a young, smartly dressed woman of middle-class appearance was standing in front of my cell. She called me by name. This was the first visitor I had seen since my capture. The CID had not recorded my abduction or my presence in the police station and did not allow me to see anyone. During my captivity, I was tortured continuously until I felt my body and mind slipping away from reality. I had started doubting my own existence. My torturers told me that I would not be going home this time. My arms were so swollen and my hands so injured, they had pulled out my fingernails, that I couldn't button up my clothes and was reduced to wearing only my underwear. Sunila and I started our friendship in these extraordinary circumstances. She had brought a message for me from Kelaniya University to tell me that the student council would be launching an all-out strike the following day, demanding an end to my torture and to my immediate release. Her courageous presence before my police cell, even for a few minutes, ensured that there was a witness to my abduction and torture. And that's, of course, he's speaking about his experiences during the early 70s when obviously many young political activists of the time were incarcerated. Tehani, could we go to the next slide? Great, thank you. And Harini, with that, over to you.
Thank you, Subha. I feel a bit nervous talking about Sunila in a panel where there are so many of you who knew her much more intimately and closely than I did. And probably also there are people in this audience listening in who knew and worked with Sunila so closely, so much more so than I did. And so I feel a bit nervous, but here goes. I feel as if I got to know Sunila much more closely after her death than during her lifetime. And this is because of my own work the last for the last 5 years or so, where I've been researching on left activism in Sri Lanka and speaking to to many people who identified themselves with left politics and who were very active in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, a very turbulent period in our country. And it would not be an exaggeration to say that almost in every interview that I did, Sunila's name would be mentioned. And I interviewed a range of people from a sort of a diversity of backgrounds, affiliated to diversity of political parties, organizations, civil society movements, and almost all of them had a story to tell me about Sunila. Something like not always as poignant as the one that you just related about Dayapala, but a conversation, a random meeting, sharing food, visiting her, or being given shelter in her home. So many different stories where Sunila seemed to have crossed the path or had some impact on the life of so many people during that time. And in many ways, played a very influential role in supporting people's activism and in sort of nurturing people, in creating networks, in facilitating networks, and in maintaining relationships. So I feel very strangely that I've got to know her much better since her death, and of course that makes me also sad that I didn't know her better when she was alive. So one of the things that many people told me about Sunila was that Sunila loved people and that she never gave up on people, and that this often got her into trouble because she knew people from such a diverse, with such a range of people, that she often was caught in the middle of supporting different people in different conflicts. And yet she would manage to maintain all those relationships. She never gave up on anyone. While others would sort of give up or get angry with each other or become distant with each other, Sunila somehow managed to maintain relationships with enemies, with her opponents, with her allies who then became opponents, but she just managed she never gave up on anyone. This was something that I often heard. And I remember this one person who told me that Sunila had once told her that she believes in the goodness of human beings, that she believes that human beings are inherently good. And the person I was interviewing was absolutely shocked at this, because she's like, how in this world where there's so much evil and so much horribleness and nastiness and cruelty, and someone who's seen a lot of that cruelty and seen some of the worst of of what humans are capable of, still believe that humans are intrinsically, inherently good. How can you believe? How can someone believe that? And to me, that sort of really really exemplifies what Sunila is, and in a way is also very reflective, I feel, of left activism in that moment, and is so different to the kind of mood that we are in today as activists, or even as people who claim to be representing some kind of left-wing socialist activism. So that in a way, Sunila reflected I mean, I want to use, I'm using this word very conscious of the connotations, but the innocence of that time as well, where, you know, there was a belief in the possibility of change, belief that you could actually intervene and make things better, that things could improve, that transformation was possible. And I see that as such a crucial fundamental part of left activism and left politics, and something that perhaps we have lost today, which is also indicative of the state of left politics, perhaps. So for Sunila and for many others, and this is something that I'm particularly interested in, and I think even Ambika also alluded to this in terms of Shanthi's life. There was no separation between their activism and the rest of their life. All of this was very, very much integrated, was the boundaries between your intimate relationships and your political life were extremely blurred. So their life, in a sense, their whole sort of very existence, the way they lived their life, was all part of their activism, was part of their politics. And I think in some ways it was this era of experimenting with different ways in not only how you do your politics, but also different ways in how you could live your life. And of course, this is not all sort of rosy and not always lovely and nice and free of conflict. It was often very messy. There were lots who suffered through this, a lot who were damaged by it. Some of what went on, and the sort of the less savory aspects of intimate relationships, and intimate relationships that are carried out in a sort of a political public space as well. So it wasn't certainly all sort of, you know, nice and lovely and friendly and full of comradeship or sisterhood or brotherhood or whatever it is. But what I also learned through these interviews with this generation of activists is that there were lots of wonderful things that also happened, and not least importantly, the amazing connections that people had with each other, and the passion with which they lived their lives. Their lives were messy, their lives were far from perfect, and looking back today, you can even question whether what they actually achieved, whether the sort of excitement that they had about the possibility of transformation and how you can sort of change the world, what kind of a legacy that has left us. But nevertheless, those were lives that were lived really passionately and with great sort of great hope, I would say, great hope and optimism. And in my own work today, I feel that that is something that we miss. We are far more cynical, and we are far less convinced about the possibility of change, the possibility of transformation. And these interviews almost sort of, often when doing these interviews, I felt envious of that generation for the sense of possibility that they had about the world, that they carried with them, which was such a sort of fundamental part about how they lived their lives. So, Subha, let me stop there for the moment. That's okay.
Yes, thank you so much. Great. Thank you, Harini. So with that, we would like to move on to Wardani Karunaratne, who's our next speaker, who is a lawyer who's defending our rights, our environmental rights, and is defending our right to have an environment, and is trying to save our forests along with many other colleagues and others who are like her, very passionate about this cause. And through her, we would like to pay tribute to Kamini Vitharana. And Tehani, if we could just go to the image of Kamini, please. So Kamini, again, many will know that she was, of course, an old leftist political figure. She stood for elections in her time and organized within the LSSP. But of course, what she's really best known for is that she became a leading scientist who was dedicated to the cause of environmental conservation in this country and the defense of our forests. She founded Rukrakaganno with her sister Irangani and remained on the board of the Center for Environmental Justice until her death, but also many other organizations and collectives which were fighting for, environmental conservation. And right, one second. Yes, and I'd like to remember, I'd just like to read her, Kamini, as remembered by Kusum Atukorala. Humble as in the manner of the truly great, she never pulled ranks, never boasted of her influential connections, never sought prominence, never jostled to get into the best position in pictures, and never minded sharing rooms with juniors at conferences. In the various organizations she had founded and worked for, Rukrakaganno Environmental Foundation Limited, Center for Environmental Justice, Center for Women's Studies, we would all miss her presence and quiet confidence in taking on environmental and gender challenges head on. I will most miss her at the annual partner forum of the Sri Lanka Water Partnership, where she was also a founder member and was always in attendance since its inception in 2002. She only missed out one event, and that was just last year in 2019. One unforgettable memory is when I undertook to produce a film on mini hydros in Sabaragamuwa and persuaded Kamini, who had many reservations, to be a part of it. This is where I realized that all the acting abilities in the family seemed to have been vested with Irangani. The shoot proceeded very slowly, to say the least, as Kamini fluffed her lines repeatedly. The camera crew was sweating, I was sweating, and poor Kamini, clutching the side of a large rock with her daughter Ranmal in attendance, kept protesting that she is not an actress like her sister. Periodically, we would all burst out laughing. So I thought that memory would be a nice way to remember her at this moment. And Wardani, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Subha. Yes, in tribute to Kamini Vitharana, what I could recall is I've been seeing her last 20 years, all the time with that amazing smile. But I must say, there was a fearless crusader behind that smile. She started her conservation works in 60s or rather 70s, and she contributed over 6 decades for the environmental conservation of this little island. And she's not just an environmentalist only. She is a brave soldier behind destruction of forest as well as all kinds of natural heritage. Kamini is a remarkable woman by any account. Apart from her conservation efforts, she is a campaigner for social justice. As Subha mentioned, her involvement is so much diversified. It's not just an environment, and she was very passionate in empowering women and mobilizing localized women groups for sustainable livelihood projects. She has some point contested to the parliament from left political front as well. And her involvement in socio-economic aspects should also be really recognized. As Subha mentioned, Ruk Rakagano is one of her great aspirations came into reality. And we could see even in the today, with this so much complex environmental issues, still this Ruk Rakagano is placing their voice in an appropriate manner and timely. And she served as a president of this organization more than 12 years and contributed so many organizations, including Environmental Foundation, which I also involved at some point. And she was contributed to several other organizations as well in different capacities, and with her scientific knowledge was a kind of a great asset for the environmental community, especially people like us who was mostly having the legal background. We always used to rely on them to get that environmental science component embedded into our legal battles in court. And she was like involved with several battles. And if I may recall, the landmark battle, I would say the Singharaja rainforest battle. There was a plan to send Singharaja for mechanized logging in 1970s by a Canadian company for plywood with the blessings of the government then. So with their contribution and effort, finally, they managed to stop that and to reserve this natural asset. It's not just a Sri Lankan thing, now it's become a world heritage and it would remain as so many decades. But if you look at in the present environmental issues in Sri Lanka, those are more complex and increased drastically. But hardly we could see many credible people who are contributing and who takes these battles forefront to protect this natural heritage for our next generation. I would say the rate of deforestation and loss of biodiversity is now alarming. Just try to recall how many such stories you could come across on media every day. It could be destruction of several national parks, maybe Singharaja, maybe Floodplains National Park, Vilpattu, or maybe loss of biodiversity, the killing of elephants, leopards. Why we got so anxious when we hear those places and species? It's because it is part of our natural heritage. And I would say Kamini was one of the key leading partners who fought against those abusing of our natural resources and tried their level best in different ways and means, maybe through litigation as well as through advocacy. And also she had a very good quality. I must recall that she was very generous in contributing her knowledge and her experience and assisting the government departments and strengthening the hands of those government officials to do their job properly. So because of that, there was some sort of more proactive involvement from these social justice regimes, especially for these public interest organizations in that context. And they were throughout playing this watchdog business. But unfortunately, in present context, I would say there's only few organizations who are taking this forefront in these battles, and civil society involvement is very much limited. So in that context, why would we worried about protecting these environmental assets? And is it just for the survival of human beings? No. Or is there any possibility of quantifying these assets by means of rupees and cents? No. Because why? Why we required all these things? Because it is the services they are providing and it is the ecosystem that gives the shelter for millions of people now as well as the future generation. So does that mean only this protected species and the forest are important? No, it is not so. Why I'm throwing this question over to you is you must be aware of this new development regarding this new circular about other state forests. If you look at that, one would tend to believe when you look at the wording, avashesha kala, meaning that there's no value or there's no importance of these protected, the protection given for these species. As well as I'm just trying to recall what's given in the 2021 budgetary proposal. It's very interesting to see that 35,000 lakhs has been allocated for reforestation of 15,000 acres under this proposal. And also one would be appraising for scientific way of amalgamating ministries and departments. If you look at the wildlife department, the wildlife is under one minister, whereas the other part is with the other minister. But in reality, what is happening on the ground? You could see mass scale forest land alienation all over the country, including several districts, and it could be Monaragala, Anuradhapura, Badulla, everywhere. And if you check those things against the government and their own policies and mandates, what does that mean? The Saubhagya Dakma, the propaganda, the election propaganda of this present government proclaimed that they would increase the forest cover by 30% and also increase 3% of the forest cover. But what is actually happening on the ground is totally contrary to what has been promised to the people of this republic, as well as it is indeed a violation of their other commitments like given towards the international community, I would say. So when it comes to 2015 Paris Summit, the nationally determined contributions, that is what we have left behind. And same with the sustainable development goals. And it go against the land use policy as well. So by carefully going through this new circular, which was adopted in November 2020, issued under the hand of the Secretary of Ministry of Wildlife, the purpose of that regulation is supposed to be to provide provision to use these lands for economic and other productive purposes without causing any harm to wildlife and other forests by the district secretaries and the divisional secretaries. So it is clear now the alienation of this power has been now vested with the district and divisional secretaries, and that would be disastrous for the forest cover and the biodiversity in this country. But if you look at the previous regime applicable for this thing, entailed in circular number 1 of 2020, circular number 5 of 2001, it is so much different from this. Why I am saying that? Under that, all these forests are mostly managed under the Department of Forest Department, where there's a special review committee has been appointed. With their supervision only, these lands has been released for any development purposes. But under this now, this new circular, I would say this exercise itself smells more like land grabbing. If you look at the numbers, the other state forests comprise of 1.7 million acres of forest land, and in total 5% of the forest cover. And it's becoming the norm in several districts to release this land purely for agricultural purposes. If you look at Kantale, 2,000 acres, again, several other companies' names are now popped in, like Avant Agro, Aurora, like that. Everywhere, every single part of the country has been now supposed to be fragmented if they are going to continue in such manner, because the total is more than 1 million acres including the forest catchments of river banks and elephant corridors, habitats will be gone lost. And it is a fact that almost 70% of our elephant population and 60% of our leopards live outside the national parks and forest reserve. Their habitat is this other state forest, which is now going to be grabbed under this new circular. And I'm sure you must be aware there are 12 killings of leopards reported in last 11 months, less than over a year. So this is that too much? Isn't it too much for this lonely planet, the best travel destination in the world? And if you look at why this sudden need to do away with Circular 5 of 2011, the one previously applied in this context, it is because the environmentalists allege the attempt to waste these lands from these divisional secretaries is an attempt to release for large-scale agricultural and other commercial purposes. And also why it really matters is if you look at the present socio-political context, these things are happening. I would believe that you could remember this Amaraveera, the Minister Amaraveera's conduct recently recorded, because so much pressure on these public officials so that we might not be able to see these criteria are fully complied with when releasing those land. And again, asking the question, so why it is illegal to issue these lands under, whether it's under the divisional secretary or whether it's under the forest department, is serve the same purpose, because we need land for the development. So that is where this whole concept of sustainable development is coming into place. I would say Kamini was one of those legends who was always fighting to get this proper balance between development and environment. She was never a tree hugger. At some point, yes, there had to be tree huggers when it comes to issues like conserving Sinharaja from this massive development project. But apart from that, I would say with the knowledge I have gathered and with the experience I have worked with her, she always tried to strike a balance between these two elements in reaching the concept of sustainable development in the modern context. But here, unfortunately, we couldn't see those nitty-gritties are taken into in this new developments in law. Because if you look at the law, it is very clear. There's no such provision to declare or to identify such forest category called Avashesha Kala. Because whatever the forests are recognized as protected, specific protection is given either under the Forest Ordinance or the Fauna and Flora Protection Ordinance, National Heritage Wilderness Areas Act, or under the National Environmental Act. So by introducing this new circular, it is basically against the pith and substances of these laws, and it does not carry any legal validity. And if you look at the provisions under the Forest Department, the Section 20 clearly deals with this kind of other state forest, and doing any such activity, what we call are prohibited, and there will be some criminal consequences as well for the people who are violating those things. So in that context as well, it is clear the validity of this circular to be questioned. And I believe one of the organizations, that is Center for Environmental Justice, where this Kamini was also one of the non-executive directors, has now brought this matter before court, and it is before court for adjudication. And I could recall my memory as well when I was working in this kind of identical matter. We have heavily relied on the previous circular that was introduced in 2001 for the benefit of protecting these other state forests. That was over some plantation next to Yala National Park, which was now not recognized as a protected area. But under this circular, we were managed to got rid from unsustainable development project that had been proposed and commenced at that point with the blessings of the incumbent management at that point of the Department of Wildlife. And if somebody is thinking, why shouldn't we need some land for the development? Shouldn't our farmers to also be considered in this process, because they have been always a fact that most of them are like marginal or underprivileged, and their income is below the par. So, but if you look at the facts and figures, it is very clear it is nothing to do with the empowerment of the this farming community in Sri Lanka, because this is purely kind of an attempt to land grabbing. And farmers are being only used as pawns in these proceedings. Why I'm saying that is with the facts and figures available with me. If you look at the land use planning department information, it clearly says there's 33% of the land expense is dedicated for agriculture industries, but only 12% of that is used in productive manner. So it's all about increasing the productivity of underutilized cultivation land, or else it has also been recognized the possibility of use 21% of the land expanse for repurposes, meaning that it has not been actively used for some other purpose, now can be utilized for agriculture. So by looking at the way forward, I think Kamini reminds me the duty of the present generation to protect such natural wealth from distractions. That could be caused by either construction of roads, hotels, or fragmentation, or using this forest for non-forest purposes without adhering to environmental requirements. She gives us a great inspiration for us to fight battles to protect our natural heritage for the present and also for our future generations or generations yet to come. And to reach that destiny, I think it is very important to mobilize Green Army. The civil society participation on these conservation efforts are very much integral part of these battles, and also build strong public service. I think we need more people like Devani and other some officers who may have noticed in news regarding this floodplains national park who fought for the right reason. And also I would finally remind you the citizens' responsibility that Kamini was always harping on, because it's always good to do something or do your duty even in your personal capacity, other than waiting for somebody to do that, or other than just blaming the government or the political parties for not doing the right thing. So I think we must all try to protect and preserve our environment even in our small capacities. And also legal practitioner, I think we'll have to really reconsider the existing legal structure, the technical barriers that has been created in the colloquial legal processes, to minimize those battles and to enhance the access to justice, so that people could come and write for their environmental rights in more appropriate manner, so that we can preserve this small, lonely planet for our next generation. Thank you.
Thank you, Wardani. With that, I think we would like to move to Sarala. And with Sarala's segment, we'll be paying tribute to Rajini Thiranagama. Sarala, could you just check is your share screen okay?
Yeah, let me just do that now. Host disabled participant screen sharing, it says.
Okay, let me try to just, okay, you should be able to screen share, but just give us a moment, because we have an image that we would just like to share first, and then you can go ahead. Great, thank you. So, just to remember Rajini Thiranagama, again, I think many of us know, she was a doctor, she was a university lecturer, she was a co-founder of University Teachers for Human Rights. And she went on to, of course, co-write with the others at UTHR, Broken Palmyra, which became a really important and early documentation of the violence that was being perpetrated both by state and non-state actors in the North. in the 80s. And of course, what we remember sort of most historically in some sense is the chapter 5, which was called No More Tears, Sister, which was, one of the earliest sort of sources from which people on the ground living in that area wrote and documented very clearly that there were serious acts of violence against women happening, and military violence, and also other sexual assault, etc., that was just occurring rampantly at the time. And that again became a very important source. So I would just like to read Rajini as remembered by her daughter Narmada. And we would like to also really thank Narmada again. I'm not sure if she is here, but thank you so much for this lovely picture. We really love this picture. So we're happy to be able to share it with you all. So Narmada wrote, Rajini did not get accustomed to grief or fear. She was heartbroken when students went missing and cried at the stories she heard. She cried from fear as well. I fell asleep many nights listening to her tears. The next morning, she would be bright, brave, determined, and hopeful. She taught me courage coexisted with vulnerability, kindness, and sensitivity. She had empathy and generosity for nearly everyone she met, except powerful people who turned their face away. As a medical doctor, she would go and treat anyone who needed her, whether they were her enemies or not. Civilians, soldiers, militants, she was their doctor. She was also a research scientist who was fearless in her pursuit of truth and who followed where the evidence led. She was a workaholic, up at dawn to prepare for classes. She kept an immaculate house, ran her university department. She then did all the advocacy, investigation, and human rights work in the evening. All this while dealing with the war and its challenges. My mother wanted life for everyone. She was utterly uninterested in the politics of death and martyrdom. She helped me find joy in a cup of tea after a bombing raid, the freedom of a day or an hour of silence or peace. We found reasons to laugh and smile. Then they killed her. I have these clear, treasured memories, not just of events, but of her, the space she took up, her gaze, her emotions, because life felt very, very short in Jaffna. But I never thought it would be her who would die. Thank you. And over to you, Sarala. And Tehani, we can stop our screen share so that Sarala can speak.
Hello, everyone. Just give me a minute to figure out the screen share. Okay.
Yeah, it's working.
So, is there somewhere to make it like a full screen so you don't see notes? Right, great, okay. So, when I was asked to connect my work involved collectively to Rajini's life and work, I also, like Ambika, went back to books. I was digging in my bookshelf. I was reading old documents, etc. And I came across many women who seem to have connected during that time. So Rajini Sivaramani, who was a poet, Ina, so my mother, Sriyani Pereira. So memories and stories of them were in books, in poetry, and all of these women were very different, but they all engaged in public life. So this photo is of one of the memorial events that happened in 2000, anniversary of Rajini. And we'll go through this little booklet, found this letter, and it's published in the booklet, and it's a letter to Kamla Basin, who is in New Delhi. She's an Indian feminist, from Sunila. And this really struck me, and I thought I'm going to frame my talk today on this. Email carries love, carries a shared grief. It refers to feminist histories move from Bangalore to Bangladesh, Sri Lanka. The email refers to Lena and Rajini and hundreds. So this is where I want to start this talk. So on solidarities, on connections, on friendships and love. And these that broke through existing boxes of nation state, of who love, how love, and what we can imagine as resistance. Just to read this letter, it says, "Dear Kamala, thank you so much for all the support and caring during these last days. If ever we get around to publishing the Bangalore sessions, we should dedicate it to Rajini. Remember Bangladesh and Lena? Why is it our fate to lose these lovely and oh so precious women at a time when we need them the most? It seems so unfair. The empty space left in our lives and in our work by Lena's death is still as empty as ever. Nobody can take her place. And it's the same for Rajini. And then one thinks of the hundreds others who have died. And it really makes you so angry. Love, Sunila." Lena connected in this letter are connected by the feminist solidarities. Feminist solidarities that were transcending borders and violence. Died in 1987. The state was looking for her political activism with the JVP. She was 37. Rajini was killed by the LT in 1999 for her political work and thoughts, and she was 35. Both thinkers, feminine political activists, both have been called revolutionaries, left revolutionaries. Both were founders of key feminist spaces such as Purani in Jaffna and Women and Media Collective Colombo. Perhaps the thinkers of even a South Asian feminist movement in the 1980s that Kamala and Sunila refer to in that letter. So this picture here is a booklet I found after my mother's death in her bookshelf, which is a small booklet published by Women and Media Collective for the first anniversary of Lena's death. So it's a collection of poetry and writing, and it's just unbelievably amazing. So coming to the work I am involved in now and the roots of that. So it's the same friendships and trust that forms the roots. In the book True, which is published by the Surya Women's Development Center, Chitra, who I think is listening today, speaks of Faizun, Beria, Sunila, Kumi, all of them getting together at this place called Flame Restaurant in Burrell. And how they were talking and thinking how to respond to the context of that time. And then in this photo, Reggie David, Jayanti, several of the women from Jaffna had also been displaced to Colombo, and were also trying to listen to what was going on. Then there were spaces that Chitra talks about in the book Kutru, like Muslim Women's Research and Action Forum, which gave space for feminist thinking, a new vibrant space of resistance. Chitra talks of the first workshop in Tamil, Colombo. She mentioned Shanthi Sachithanandam, who Ambika spoke about, that she was also there. And there were other spaces during the time, like Women and Media Collective, where Lena was, and WERC. So there was shared politics and a determination to keep these spaces of resistance. I also just want to note the importance of books like Kutru. There are several books that document feminist histories, but this one, edited by Chitra Maunaguru and Marilyn Weaver, documents the histories of feminist activism in Tamil-speaking areas, particularly the East. The individuals as well as the broader movements, the known stories and the unknown stories. The known stories which we hear and read about, and the unknown stories which we had to dig out from oral narratives and old memories of friends and colleagues. Kutru is important because we try to remember many of the feminist thinkers and activists of the 1980s and remember their friendships, so not alone, and remember their relationships. It is hard to speak of one without speaking of another. So, jumping to some of the work that I'm involved in now, connecting to friendships and solidarities and keeping spaces of resistance alive. It's a group called the Muslim TMS for short. And it's a group of women who've been working together for a long time over troubled histories, but specifically came together following the anti-Muslim violence in Gama and Darga town in the south in 2014. Even though we came together as Tamil Muslim sisters, Sinhala sisters, over the years our conversations and determination has been about not wanting to be bound by a particular group or an interest group or a particular box that we are assigned or come from. We were not going to only speak identified as important by the powers of the powers within our own boxes. To continue in a way which is not bound by structures and slowly chipping away at very boxes. So that's like make with some of the that I mentioned. Solidarities that are boundless, friendships, trust, also processes of confronting the reality we are living in and asking uncomfortable questions. I think Rajini's life is about that. Having awkward and difficult conversations and Lena too in her writing. And in that sense, this is the legacy on which we have our activism now. So I would like to speak through 3 stories to kind of help explain the work of the TMS group of which I am one member. So 1990 on the 5th of
Sarala, sorry, can I just pause you for 1 second?
Yeah.
Sorry, sorry to interrupt. I think your audio is not that great. So maybe if you could switch your video off for now, that might help the audio.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
One second. Is this
Yeah, you're still kind of going in and out, but hopefully it'll be better now. I think just carry on. And if there's something, if it's still bad, I'll let you know. Thanks.
okay? Yeah. So the first story is about 1990 on the 5th of September. 1 second, I'm going to try and change my mic also. Hold on. Hi, is this better?
Yes, I think that's better. Thank you.
Okay. 158 men and boys were taken away from a refugee camp which was at the Eastern University in front of their families by the military, and they were never seen again. There is a common narrative in the communities that Muslim informants were working with the military to identify people, and that also this was in retaliation against the massacres of innocent Muslim civilians in Eravur and Katangudi by Tamil militants earlier the same year. Unlike in the north, where there was army, the LTT, and for a short period the IPKF, in the east the context was different because Tamil and Muslim communities were implicated in the violence. There was the army, but the narratives of these experiences implicated the other, could be in one instance, armed Tamil militant groups or collaborators from Muslim communities who work with the military. Narratives of hate, pain, revenge is commonplace even today. Or more often, there is just silence. So the TMS group started by sharing these experiences from different communities, holding together the experiences of pain and also doing the hard work of listening. A Muslim sister, I will call her Niyasa, would share her childhood memories of her father being taken away by the LTTE and killed. And she would also listen as her sister Ranjini would share her memories of both her brothers being taken away by the army, never to be seen again from the university massacre, university disappearance, sorry. Later together, we would paint this flower pot to remember her brothers and others who were taken away. The words carefully written on the pot by the hands of Nyasa. The pot was later safely placed within the university garden. The words say, "Please water me," to remember those who had disappeared on the 5th of September 1990 from this campus. The next story I want to share with you is from 2019. Following the Easter Sunday bomb blasts, there was a huge backlash against the Muslim community in the East. There were rampant stories of infertility drugs being put in food made and served by Muslims. So we decided to make food together, more buttermilk. We served the buttermilk to the pilgrims going to the Mamangam Kovil. We wanted to make interventions in things core to how people lived. In some ways, it was very frightening, serving drinks to pilgrims on the last stretch of their walk to the Hindu Kovil. On the other hand, it was non-threatening, women making buttermilk, doing everyday things as resistance. The rumors about the infertility drugs were so harmful because it tore away at everyday life and interdependency. So our interventions in our everyday spaces of walking, living, moving around, going for worship was specifically to challenge that, and also to in some ways raise the questions, what is sacred and what is polluted. My last story is of Rifayedin, and this is from the last few months. A smaller group of us, some younger women and some of us, have been meeting to explore deeper ways of listening and documenting our histories. We are exploring this through sharing our own stories first, reflecting on the emotional aspects of it, reflecting on how we listen to one another, because to kind of respect how hard it is actually to speak and remember, and to respect that when we are speaking to others. Some of us have committed to exploring more within our own families to fill in the gaps of fragments of histories we know about our own past. So this is a photo of Rifayedin, and it's the only photo. He was 10 when he was shot by the LTTE. His younger sister was sharing her memories of him, the fragments of stories she remembers told to her. She told us about his watch and how proud he was of it. We also talk about how hard it was to sit and listen to this kind of mindless brutality in the name of a liberation struggle. So to kind of summarize the three stories, it's about to find connections across history of war and brutality. It's about resistance being every day and trying to touch a core of like everyday living, and also in steps to practice to be reflective and slow. So I'd like to end with questions. Of course, there's lots of questions. First of all, what is with this name? We came up with it for a particular moment in history and time. Should we still keep it as Tamil, Muslim, Sinhala sisters? Or if not, if we are going beyond these boxes, what do we call ourselves? And other questions, personally for me also, is about what it means to engage through religion and religious structures and religious spaces and religious discourse, and challenging within that as a feminist activist. Also, among our group, we have very diverse views. We may be from so-called the same box of a particular religion, but we may hold diverse views even within that. And we may hold diverse views about rights also. So there are times where we do talk about it. There are other times where we are not ready to talk about it. And also this process is not about kind of mass mobilization. There aren't hundreds of women who are part of this process since 2014. It's slow and it's small. So there's a critique of that as well. So I want to end with Rajini. I found this image online while reading about her. It was published in the Sunday Observer in 2019 as part of her memorial. It's a letter, I think, from her to her daughter, where she writes, "My daughter, in a land where they talk about peace and make war, a land of cruel men and subdued women, be of strong heart, strong head, and strong emotions." Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarala. Now, we'll just move to our final speaker. And I just wanted to share this image of Professor Swarna Jayaweera. Oops, sorry. Sorry. Just give me a moment. And then we move to our last speaker, Niyanthini. So Professor Swarna Jayaweera was obviously, I think many of us will know her as a very major educationist that really pushed education reform and many sort of important conversations within that space in this country. But she was also very intimately connected to Senwar. And I think many of us might also know her from there. And I would like to read a remembrance by a student of hers, Asoka Jayasena, to pay tribute to her. Despite her work at the universities, her greatest achievement was the establishment of Senwar, which is the Center for Women's Research, just to be clear. Senwar, to aid in the empowerment of women and help make their voices heard. She functioned as the joint coordinator of Senwar since its inception in 1985 and guided its activities for over 25 years. Most of the novice researchers, including postgraduate students, were grateful to her for providing them with opportunities to make their voices heard through research forums held at Senwar. Through joint ventures with other parties, she was able to make Senwar one of the most highly regarded independent research organizations, both in Sri Lanka as well as in Asia. But despite all the recognition and the respect she received from all over the world, to us she was the most simple, unassuming, and approachable teacher. We were all amazed at the way she delivered comparative education lectures covering the education systems of several countries, all without the use of a single piece of paper. We were simply mesmerized by her expertise and knowledge. My love for that subject developed due to the grounding laid by her. She loved to see old students progressing in their careers and was always ready to provide advice, guidance, and encouragement. And I'll just stop there and hand over to you, Niyanthini.
Thank you, Subha. I'm glad to be part of this important gathering. I also feel highly inadequate, given all the wonderful women who have spoken before me and the kind of work they are doing within the women's movement in Sri Lanka, but also it's difficult to remember such great icons who have contributed immensely to the feminist movement as well. I'm honored to be speaking about Professor Swarna Jayaweera. I did not know her personally. The few times I've seen her at Senwa, for example, I did not have the courage to go up and speak to her. However, I think her work is what I am familiar with, and her work has influenced my own academic journey in a very special way. And I want to, in this talk, just reflect on like the relevance of her work to some of the current challenges facing public education in Sri Lanka. So when I was doing my master's in labor studies, I drew a lot from Swarna Jayaweera's work on the impact of structural adjustment programs on women's labor. And then when I decided to move to education, which is what I'm currently researching, I was thrilled to find out that she was a professor of education. Like, we knew a lot of her feminist work. And one of her key contributions was to think about women's education. But I did not know that she was a professor of education herself. And I think in the coming years as well, I will be continuing to engage with the work that she has done. She was a prolific writer. She published many books and articles, even by like the 1960s. And so she's left with us like decades of rich research work she's done, looking at the education system in Sri Lanka, but also in Asia and elsewhere as well. So thinking about the question of public education in Sri Lanka, I think the distinct feature of education in Sri Lanka is that we have an extensive free public education system through which the majority of our population is educated. Few countries around the world currently have a non-fee levying education from the primary till the university levels. And through this system, we've also seen high enrollment of girls in schools, but also up to the highest level. And women have been able to perform well in this system as well. So one of the questions that I have been personally curious about is to think about how Sri Lanka managed to maintain this free public education system even after the neoliberal turn since the late 1970s. And how is it that the idea of education being free is strongly embedded in people's imagination in Sri Lanka, that even successive governments have been reluctant to dismantle the free education system fully, although they may have supported privatization in different ways. These questions have fascinated me. Is it, did the kind of the politics and the struggles by students and teachers contribute to it? How did, for example, international donors continue to support the free education system? And these, I think, curious questions and specific questions to the Sri Lankan education system. Now, however, we have lots of challenges and you know, questions that we have to continue to encounter within this free public education system. And the problem is defined for us by different people. Some people tend to talk about a crisis in education. And so given the short time here, I just want to focus on one example of a way in which the problem of education in Sri Lanka is being defined. And that is through this idea of developing human capital. So now if you look at the concept of human capital, if there was one concept that has been dominant in the education sector globally, not just in Sri Lanka, and has been a favorite among policymakers, it is this concept of human capital. And this was introduced by economists from the Chicago School in the 1960s. And you know, Chicago boys, as they are commonly known, they've also known for taking forward the neoliberal economic thought globally. The concept of human capital basically is concerned with making productive humans when they become adults who are useful for the marketplace, and that, you know, education increases the economic benefits for the individual as in addition to making them productive, and that achieving high human capital development is important for any country in order to achieve the next level of economic growth. So this idea is quite strong everywhere, in Sri Lanka as well, and it has remained strong since the 1960s. For example, the World for Sri Lanka last year, 2019, is titled Realizing the Promise and Potential of Human Capital, and has an extensive framework of how to restructure education in order to achieve better human capital development. Just a few weeks ago, the World Bank also released a Human Capital Index report. And in that, I think Sri Lanka has scored about 0.60 in terms of the index. It was said that Sri Lanka is doing well in comparison to other South Asian countries, not so well when compared to East Asian countries or Australia, for example. The news report talking about this also highlighted that although women have achieved high human capital index score in Sri Lanka, it has not translated into benefits or higher earnings in the labor market. Now, to me, when that is said, it seems like there is a deep contradiction in the way the human capital theory itself is framed. Now, the question is, now this is one kind of framing of the problem of education in Sri Lanka. How do we confront it? This is where I think the contribution of feminists like Swarna Jayaweera comes in. The concept of human capital has been critiqued, and there was a lot of pushback from economists, from people within the education sector, but also by feminists. For example, Wendy Brown, in her book Undoing Demos, talks about how looking at the concept of Homo economicus, talks about how within the neoliberal era, the concept of human capital has been pushed as the dominant concept, and that this concept ignores the idea of democratic citizenship, right, or developing humans for democratic citizenship. It undermines the publics and poses a threat for democracy itself. And in that whole tradition, I think Swarna Jayaweera has also been engaging with this idea from way back since when it was proposed. And what I find interesting is that it's still very relevant to the debates that we are having here. Not only is the idea of human capital spoken of by international agencies and donor groups, it's also taken up by local policymakers, articulated maybe in different ways as a problem of employability, for example, or the problem of unemployed graduates who are being produced out of this free education system in Sri Lanka. Swarna's work was mainly focused on looking at the links between education, the economic mobility, and social empowerment. She engaged with the ideas put forward by human capital theorists, functional theorists, and development theorists. And I think through her painstaking empirical work that she did through her research, she showed how the structural adjustment programs are not benefiting women's labor, for example, for women, or that the development ideas put forward, the dominant development frameworks were not really leading to women's empowerment. And in terms of education too, she was passionate about pushing forward alternate ways of thinking about the problem of education. In the question of women in higher education and the question of employment for women, she looks at how the social class variables and gender norms are actually limit the potential of education for women, right? She showed that there is a class, socioeconomic class differential among women when it comes to the benefits of education, although they achieve same levels of education. She also shows the differences, the gender differences between men and women who achieve same levels of education, and due to gender norms and so on, are unable to benefit or participate in the same way in formal employment. She drew her a theoretical orientation from conflict theories. She also drew her theoretical orientation from social reproduction theories like Pierre Bourdieu, who constantly were trying to show that in education spaces, the socioeconomic inequalities and other gendered norms and so on manifest or are reproduced or socially reproduced. Professor Swarna Jayaweera's contribution also is important in terms of her work with other feminists who were engaged in critiquing the dominant concepts that were being put forward by neoclassical economics. So her work around the feminist critiques of structural adjustment programs, I think, is an important one. But there are many other contributions that she has made. So I just want to leave with that thought, right? And while we think about how to confront the challenges that we are facing in public education, I think people like Swarna's work and their scholarship have given us ideas and tools to help us not just formulate and reformulate the problems, but also in very concrete terms in how we can kind of confront them. So I'll maybe stop there for now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Niyanthini. We don't want to of course, assume that everyone here knows our speakers, though, of course, many of us do. I thought it would be just good to do a quick recap of who each of you are. So, just to do a quick introduction. So, if anyone wants to look your work up or anything like that, or connect, I think that might be helpful. So Niyanthini Kadirgamar, who just spoke, is a researcher, feminist researcher, and an activist, and is currently a PhD student of education at the University of Massachusetts. Harini Amarasuriya is an academic, an activist, I think taught for many years at the Department of Sociology at the Open University, and is currently serving as a member of Parliament. So thank you for that, Harini, from all of us. Sarala Emmanuel is also a feminist researcher and an activist who has worked on transitional justice, economic justice. She's been involved with the People's Commission on Land. She's involved with the Domestic Workers Union. And importantly, she works with young women and girls to build feminist politics and collectives. Wardani Karunaratne is a lawyer and a legal consultant at the Environmental Foundation Private Limited, and has, I think, been involved in lots of very important litigation in terms of environmental conservation. And Ambika Satkunanathan, finally, is also a feminist lawyer, an activist, a former human rights commissioner here in Sri Lanka. And I think it's important to note was, very much involved, and I think, in fact, spearheaded the forthcoming Human Rights Commission report on prisons, which I think we are all really hoping will, provide a very important foundation to a very much needed conversation about the prison system in this country. So that's just a quick recap of who all our speakers are. And we were going to have a little segment where you could ask a question of each other if you had any, but I think we unfortunately don't have too much time for that. So I'd just like to ask our participants if anyone has a question for either of our any of our speakers. Any thoughts, comments, questions? If you're feeling a little shy, you can also put it in the chat, or you could even send it to me privately, and I'm happy to read it out. We don't have to name you or anything like that. So there's all these different ways to do it. But also, if while our participants maybe get a little less shy, if any of our speakers do have a question or something that they'd like, a remark that they, something that came to their minds that they'd like to say while someone else was speaking, I think that would be great. So yeah, any of you have any questions for each other? Really? No questions? Any thoughts, reflections? I mean, I have lots, but I don't want to take up space.
Yeah, maybe Subha, I just while listening, can I say
Go ahead,
something?
Harry. Yeah, of course.
Quickly?
Yeah.
Listening to everybody, I was thinking also, I mean, how much each one of these have contributed, each of these women have contributed to mentoring others, mentoring and sort of supporting especially sort of younger feminists. And I think Swarna was a classic example of someone who did that. And I think all of the others too. And I think that's really kind of really quite important in the feminist movement, that sort of intergenerational connection and supporting each other and sort of the building of those sort of solidarities and networks, which I think all of these women were really, really good at. And maybe it's because of my own interest in like the way in which intimacy works in political activism. I think it's something for us to really reflect upon, because we all, sort of, not to essentialize, but politics has become so masculine and so individualized, and that, those sort of the importance of solidarity, the importance of friendship, all of that seems to be lost now. And I think in many ways, listening to all of the others about these wonderful women sort of reminded me again about, the importance of also friendship and networks and caring and support in your activism. Something that I think we've tend not to pay too much attention to today.
I mean, I think what came to my mind was when I was reading, Shanthi's, these long interviews, the transcript, is I think the importance of also documenting their lives. And I don't mean political, but in a way, when I was reading that, I felt like it was like a story, right? I was reading about history, but it was through a personal lens. So it was also very interesting because it was her take on it, the way she responded to it. So just from that, I felt, based on my recent experiences, I felt like when I reading it 8 years later, I felt I got more out of it perhaps than when I, read it then. So I think the importance of documenting those personal stories and experiences that's also very important, which once again, we in Sri Lanka are notoriously terrible at that just generally, but particularly when it comes to like personal lives, like their personal engagement with the politics.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things that we really wanted to do today, even, we were preparing what I say about each of them, we really tried to look at other people remembering them, rather than us just kind of reading out biographical information. And we really found that there's so many interesting remembrances, which are also, just very easily available online. And we all wanted to remember these women as, their friends had remembered them. Of course, in the case of Rajini, it was Narmada. In the case of Professor Swarna, it was an old student. And I think, that for me, I think it really connects to what you both were just saying, that really the very personal, deep impact that they had on people's lives across so many generations, I think is always really profound. And someone has put a question about where would you go to find out more? Well, I mean, there's so many sources. I wouldn't really know where to start. Do any of our speakers have any ideas, any tips for someone that would like to learn more?
Yeah, I would like to say something. First and foremost, can
Yes,
I say
go
something?
ahead.
Yeah, okay, thank you. First and foremost, I would like to thank to organize this wonderful meeting to know about our past or former feminist activist. Earlier, I don't know. I'm I don't like to say like that, but now I'm saying earlier I don't know one sentence about each of them, but now I have some of the better things about them. This conversation give me to a huge ideas to know about them, and give the step to know them. So this is a very wonderful conversation. Thank you so much, and I'm expecting more conversations like this. I'm surely told you all they did a huge work to us, and we also try to go with their path. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thanks for being here with us, and we're very happy to hear that you took something away from this really wonderful conversation. Kumi, would you like to go next?
Yes, Subha, thank you so much. Thank you very much for organizing this to the Feminist Collective. And thank you to the speakers. For me, it was very poignant to listen to all of you trying to recollect both the personal and the political, starting with Shanthi to Sunila to Kamini and to Swarna. All four of whom actually at some point, and Rajini, and all of whom at some point or another probably knew and worked together, knew of or worked together with each other, and worked at a time, maybe earlier for Kamini and Swarna, but certainly contemporary colleagues as far as Shanthi and Rajini were concerned, of a particular time. And I think, in a way, pioneering feminist work, which happened in the 70s, and pioneering that work in the context of a very strong social justice conscience. Like Harini said, I don't know whether it was a time of innocence, but certainly that came together. And to have the four, five of you talk about them, looking back at that time, but talking about it and framing it in particular ways. And then the last speaker for a younger generation who absolutely did not know them. I think this was fabulous. So thank you very much. And for all the work of, finding, digging up information, linking it to today's politics. Thank you so much. It was really very, very lovely evening, very lovely remembrance.
Thanks so much, Kumi, and we're very happy that that you were here and were able to be with us this evening. There's a comment in the chat box. I'll just read it out loud because I think it helps, and then it kind of documents itself in the YouTube video as well for people who are watching it later. Someone says, I'm sincerely thankful to all the panelists, though we are nearly stepping into 2021. Feminism is still looked down upon by the majority and it terrifies us. It's amazing to see how these strong women have stood up for their beliefs regardless of all that came their way. It's definitely a confidence booster. That's good. I have always felt that the enemies of feminists have been people of our own gender who have given into the social norms because it's easier that, but the wonderful women we have heard about today show the younger generation how to break barriers and glass ceilings. Thank you. Any last thoughts from our speakers? Wow, it's. I have to say, it's quite shocking that you're all so quiet. Yes, there's a question. Sorry, one last question. In the context of much identities and positionalities, what do the speakers and others here think are our version of these friendships and camaraderie? What are the challenges? I think that's a very important and very big question. I think, Harini, you kind of began to speak about this. So could we start perhaps with your thoughts on this question?
Subha, can you repeat the question?
Or Sarala, who spoke. Sorry, yes, for sure. In the context of much more hardened identities and positionalities, what do the speakers and others think here are our version of friendships and camaraderie? And what are the challenges? Sarala, I think it would be great to hear you as well, maybe Harini and Sarala.
Yeah, Harini can go first.
Thank you, Sarala.
That's real friendship there.
That's real friendship there. I mean, I think that's a great question, and you're right. It's I think a real challenge for us. I mean that my work sort of, when I was doing my research and when I was doing those interviews, one thing that was very clear was how women managed to, and not just women actually, women and men during that time in the 70s and 80s did manage to sort of cross, especially ethnic boundaries, to sort of unite on sort of common political causes, and how, in a way, the women's movement was very sensitive to that at that point, right? I mean, there was a lot of interaction between activists of different from different ethnic groups, and you know, Kumi can talk much more about this, but if you look at sort of some of the people who were there at in Merge, the movement for interracial equality, everybody was there, from, you know, militant Tamils to the JVPers, right, to trade unionists, to feminists, right? So I think one of the what to me seems very distinctive is the fact that there were those kinds of spaces like Merge, maybe Deva Sarana, Women and Media Collective, all of these places where people could gather, and it was gathering not just sort of for workshops or for work, but just gathering to hang out also. I think they did a lot of hanging out, maybe because of all the curfews or I don't know what, but there's a lot of hanging out going on, right? And you just, you know, would be talking about books or songs, or there were cultural things going on. There's a lot of food and drink and, you know, all of these sort of very social activities as well. And these were happening in these spaces. People spent nights at Deva Sarana, you know, people slept over at Women and Media Collective. People, you know, it was sort of much more, that's what I said, like the boundaries between sort of personal and professional life was really blurred, and even in those spaces, and maybe that helped in some ways. Whereas and I think that's one of the and that kind of shifted in the 80s, I would think, right? After the sort of second JVP insurrection was crushed, things then became much more polarized ethnically, in terms of ethnic identity also. And I think there you can really see a shift in the way in which those sort of identities started hardening, and there was less and less interaction and sort of finding of sort of common ground. Maybe because I'm sort of interested in left politics, I think one of the things that happened was that left politics was like a common ideology that brought people together. And then the sort of the collapse of the left movements also then meant that, you know, it was nationalist politics that people were left with thereafter, on which you could mobilize, right? Or organize. So maybe that was one of the reasons why then, you know, we all kind of got into our little silos. But I think that's a challenge that we are currently facing also, right? How to sort of move beyond some of those, and how to kind of regain some of the fluidity of those categories, and sort of be able to reach out across some of those boxes that we seem to be driven into, whether it's ideologically or in terms of identity or whatever it is. And I think that's something that's a really good good place for us to start talking about how we can kind of, move beyond what we are currently doing.
Yeah.
Thanks, Harini.
Can I go?
Sarala?
Yeah. Sorry. Can you hear me? Sorry. I think I would answer that also connecting to what Ambika said about where you're from. And in some ways, myself having to kind of suddenly confront who the hell I am, because I think, and the kind of what I also tried to raise with this whole uncomfortableness with this name of this group, right? I think as a child, I grew up in the luxury maybe of not really having to think too much about ethnic identity for myself. And I'm also mixed. I don't fit here, there. Nobody can fit me into anything or figure out who I am. So funnily enough, right through the war years when I was working, I was an outsider, but because I didn't fit any box, and I was this kind of part of the women's rights movement, kind of, that was my identity, right? But after the war ended, suddenly there were questions by very close friends actually about saying, "You're Sinhala," and I'm like, how did this suddenly come up as a way of, so that's how how they saw me all those years while working on women's rights, human rights issues, that I was a Sinhala. So I think then later having to kind of openly talk about it, even within this group, about how we challenge these things for ourselves, but also that we cannot just be anymore somehow have the luxury of being none of these identities, right? And having to kind of work out, like, even because it's also important more and more. And I also realized how important it had been for me unconsciously to be seen as a Tamil, which half I am. And then suddenly to be seen as a Sinhala is what it like made me feel inside, right? And also this thing of like this TMS group that we are like, it's still somehow, you can't just let it go and be something else like human group or, women's group for, I don't know, peace. Like, we can't be general terms like that. None of us are okay with that. But then the only other option is to then say, like, all the letters for all possible kind of, now we'll have to add mixed, and I don't know, like, it will just keep growing and growing. Because somehow there's something about wanting to hold on, that we are also engaging as from those boxes, but trying to connect outside those boxes. So I think it kind of reflects broadly the change in feminist politics also, from being able to find that solidarity as secular left socialist kind of spaces, to now having to find those friendships of trust through religious identities, through ethnic identities, and then what would it look like? So just to finish with a conversation I had like yesterday or day before yesterday with a young colleague who's working in a women's rights organization, who said, she wanted to do something, have Pongal in the office for Saraswati Puse, and how she was told this is not allowed in this women's organization. We don't have any religious rituals in the office. There's no religious rituals are there because it's a secular space. So she was like, so she was told that's how it's always been, but like she also didn't know where that like thinking came from. And then she was like, why can't we do all rituals then, like, maybe Christmas, etc. So I suddenly realized that, and I had never had to do it, but also kind of explaining this, how kind of feminist spaces also changed from strongly being secular and wanting to be secular, but then taking it for granted that everyone will be on that page. And then younger women who may not necessarily understand why that was so important at a time, maybe in the 80s. And if not that, then what would it look like? So I think these are like those conversations and the politics around those, like how you, whether you combine, whether you have collective, whether you have connections from your box in a way, and push the box into another shape, maybe merging, whatever, or whether it's possible to be in a completely new identity space like socialist, left, feminist kind of spaces, which I was used to before. I think somewhere in between we need to find how to make those connections. But beyond all that, somehow, like, that's what I think I also learned from Sunila, like friendship and trust somehow seems to transcend all that. And you don't, or like you just remember that beyond somebody's name or where they're from or ethnic identity or religion. You remember that akka, or that, the familial terms we use for close friendships and relationships of trust. Thanks.
Thanks so much for that. And I think, yes, Ambika, go ahead.
Just to say, I mean, about kind of building trust and building solidarity. I mean, what I tell everyone is, I think I was also like Sarala in a sense, although I was aware of the ethnic issues in the public sphere, as it were, in my private spheres of even people I worked with, etc., I did not have to deal with that on a day-to-day basis. So there was a safe space. There was the outside space where you had to battle it, but there was always a safe space that you inhabited, right? Whether it was school, whether it was workplace, all that. But I think that I felt that in my everyday workspace most. I think I always tell people I felt my ethnicity the most the day I went to the Human Rights Commission. And that might seem ironic, but that also tells us the deeply ethnicized, ethno-politicized space that we live in. But what it also taught me, I think, is the ability to build trust. In a sense, you would think that it is very difficult. It is, but it's also very easy on one level. That might seem paradoxical, but it is. And it's about building trust because through your actions. And that takes a long time, which is why I think this is something for the long haul. An example I'll give you is at a point where, I wear the pottu deliberately, that's a political act. But then I want people to, when they get to know me, to look beyond it, where it doesn't actually matter, right? And I think at the commission, that was possible because when people engaged with me and they could see how I engaged, I could build trust. So an example that I give, it was very touching, is this person, kind of a older a Muslim man, who when he heard, and he had come for something, at the commission, etc., detention issues, whatnot, and when he had heard some rumor that I was going to contest, what he did was he called me up, and I thought he was calling about his issue. This was like a couple of months after I led the commission. And he actually said, oh, well, no, I heard that you were going to contest. And I actually wanted to tell you that I want to volunteer to come to Jaffna to campaign for you. And I can't even tell you how I felt, but that was just really touching. But what that showed to me is that ability. It is very difficult on one level, but on another level, it's also easy. But it requires us to reach out, and it's not something you can do overnight. And it requires you to stay, that staying power, to be always there, so that they know that you are there, and this is just not some ad hoc thing. That's how you build relationships and trust.
Thanks so much, Ambika. And I think with that, I'd just like to read a little bit, a tiny excerpt from an interview between Barbara Smith conducted by Amy Goodman Barbara Smith is, of course, you know, a really legendary Black feminist icon, was in fact one of the women who were part of the collective that actually coined the term identity politics, you know, back in the 70s when they were talking about the issues of Black lesbian women. And, you know, the whole idea was that they were saying neither the civil rights movement nor the sort of mainstream feminist movement at the time spoke to them, right? And that's where they kind of coined the term. So in this interview with Amy Goodman, you know, Amy Goodman asks her about identity, the term identity politics, what she thinks about it now, etc. And I just want to read the last bit because I just think it's a good note to end. All our speakers have just made these incredible interventions about friendship, solidarity, trust, and finding ways to, you know, identity is important, but then finding ways to also go beyond when we need to, right? So she says, well, the first thing, so Amy Goodman says, what advice would you give to any young activists around the issue of identity politics? And she says, well, the first thing I would say is you've got to work in coalition. You cannot be so immersed in your own particular experiences, your wonderful, multi-layered, complex experiences of your identity. You can't be so immersed in that you cannot look out at that person across the room, across the street, in another neighborhood, in another nation, around the globe. You cannot be so immersed in what you are experiencing that you cannot see the wider arc of a need to work for justice and to do it in coalition and in solidarity with others. And I think that's what has been lost. I think that because identity politics and Black feminism and some of the things that I have actually helped to establish in academic context, I think that sometimes when they're talked about in academic context, people don't understand that no, what we're really talking about is positioning ourselves so that we can build a mass positive political change and for justice. So when people think that the only people we're talking to are people who have the exact same list of identities that they have, I always say, why would I want to work with people who are just like me? That would be boring. So that would be my major advice, is take that risk. And on that note, I think we'll bring this really amazing evening to an end. Thank you so much to all our speakers once again. Thanks again to Aranya and Narmada for sharing the photos with us. And thank you, of course, to everyone who joined us here this evening for this wonderful 2-hour conversation. And we hope to see you again, or all of you again, very soon. Thanks all and good night.